And good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Davis Rohr with the Downtown Development District, and I'd like to welcome you to downtown. It is an honor to introduce our keynote speakers this evening here at the Manship Theater, which again is one of the creations of Plan Baton Rouge. Victor Dover is the principal at Dover Cole & Partners, chair of the Congress of New Urbanism, author of Street Design, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns. Victor Dover serves as principal in charge for many of the firm's design and planning projects. He has led more than 100 charrettes. Victor lectures widely around the nation on the topics of livable communities and sustainable development, and is the immediate past chair of the Congress of New Urbanism. It is a pleasure to welcome Victor Dover to Baton Rouge.
Good evening, everyone. You should be taking a victory lap about now, 15 years after Plan Baton Rouge. And I'll be quick because I know you want to hear from Andres' thoughts about what it means to come back and see the results 15 years later. I want to tell you that people all around the country, including in our home in South Florida, where Andres and I are neighbors, are inspired by the example that you set. You should be taking a victory lap. But don't cheer for too long. Don't high-five so close to the finish that somebody passes you. There are boom times coming. I want to talk about the coming boom that you're about to experience. Oh, I know you feel you're already in one, that things have turned around, that money is flowing in, there are cranes again on Lafayette Street. You see, every time I come here, I see more buildings with the lights back on and new things being filled in, and of course, wonderful symbols like the Shaw Center. And for the next 36 or 48 hours, we'll be in this big conversation about your growth. The one you do every year, right? No. You're in the right place at the right time because now you're having that conversation. This time, the 8th time, in the context of a coming boom that will be very different from the ones that preceded it. A growth era. A growth era with a different set of rules. A growth era where opinions change among a lot of the people who buy things, people who buy homes, people who buy transportation, about what they want. A growth era in which the rules have changed about what's cheap and what's expensive. A growth era in which some of the things that we used to take for granted, even including cheap energy, won't be there to take for granted anymore. A growth era which will happen in the context of a whole different set of assumptions. We used to think, for example, that it's perfectly rational to drive tremendously long distances just to get to where the land was cheap and the mortgage was affordable. Or to drive past 4 or 5 places you used to shop to the bigger one that was further out. Well, what difference does it make if the fuel in your vehicle is bought at $25 or $35, $45 a barrel? Those same assumptions will all change because habits we took as perfectly rational back then will be utterly unthinkable at $250 or $300 a barrel. And even so, the money that will flow here will increase as those energy prices rise. So will the costs to people, and so things will be different. Our institutions will operate differently in this new growth era. They'll be much more distributed. Our businesses will work differently. We'll have a revival of small-scale entrepreneurship, like we haven't seen in a very long time in our country. And the workforce inside those companies or in those network virtual companies and what have you, will be very demanding about their lifestyles. All of a sudden, with their electronic hookups and all their other advantages, many of the creative people that are the forces behind the job creation and the making of things are going to have every imaginable choice about where to live and where to spend their money to do it. And they're going to be very demanding and very picky about it. And so all of a sudden you're competing for their attention in a way that's different from the era of the man in the gray flannel suit. So it's a happy time because things are going to be being built. Things are going to be good. Things are going to grow. It's also an unsettling time because we're going to be doing it with a different set of assumptions. Now, one thing is true. Every other boom cycle has produced amazing, amazing transformative effects on the built environment in your region. And if you go back far enough, you can see that when they did something really small, like build a new building on the main street, or something really big, like build the soaring state capitol, previous booms have been associated with thinking big, with not being timid, with imagining what could be, even if it hadn't been there before, and building it that way, with thinking hard about design, not just quantities of what was there. So these two images are inspiring to me for that exact reason. You know, one person built a relatively modest, relatively small, relatively normal building on a street. It only looks special because it became so rare for 60 or 70 years on our continent. And in another example, you know, it came time to symbolize the new Louisiana, and the state capitol reached skyward in a really audacious move. They said, this is the new Baton Rouge, this is the new Louisiana, we're going to do something we hadn't done before. And so they were thinking big. Now, planning is full of contradictions. First of all, you did a plan. You did a great plan for Plan Baton Rouge. You did a great plan for Louisiana Speaks. And so those are done now, right? No, actually planning is kind of a verb. And you keep doing it. And you keep discovering that there's more to do. There are more blanks to fill in, and more discoveries to make, more zooming in, more neighborhoods to transform, more streets to revise, more connections to make where things are disconnected. And so you don't stop. You keep doing it. You take inspiration from the work that came before, and every generation is responsible for doing timely upgrades on top of the work that came before it. So anyway, now into this boom era. One of the things that's going to be different is that we have to live with the contradiction that thinking big is something we've always heard to do. You know, Daniel Burnham's often misquoted as having said, make no small plans. Remember that? Make no little plans, or make no small plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. There's actually no proof that Burnham actually said that, if you research it. But it's such a good story. And it sounds right. A plan that's bold enough and to capture our imaginations and make us bother to put one brick on top of another to go build it. On the other hand, Schumacher, we grew up with him saying to us on the cover of his famous book, small is beautiful. Well, how do you resolve these contradictions? The answer is, you do think big. You do lift your chins and your noses and your eyes and look across the horizon at the long term and the big picture. And then you take actions close up. It's think globally, act locally, except in the modern era, it's more like think regionally and act on your block. The new era comes with a change of assumptions about who's really in charge. The new superpowers, some would argue, are the regions, the mega regions or the super regions. And this map is interesting because Louisiana Speaks was out in front of a lot of the other regions that are depicted here. As you started thinking together and coming together in large numbers to decide what you wanted to be when you grew up. To take your principles of smart growth that sounded okay in big picture, 10 nice ideas, and see how they applied on real land in people's real cities, and how you preserved local distinctiveness as you did that. And so we're inspired by Louisiana Speaks. But look around. All the other regions are doing it too. All your competitors are busy getting their act together so they can speak with one voice, not to each other or to you, but to the rest of the world, to speak to their state capitals, to speak to Washington, to speak to their trading partners around the world. We have one of them in southeast Florida, but look up at the top of that map. Do you remember when it was called the Rust Belt? They don't call it that anymore. It's called the Lake Belt, and it's actually full of stories of resurgence and amazing places. Why? Well, for one thing, the Lake Belt is full of exciting places to go if you're a young person starting a business. Actually, I tell people all the time, if they're just getting going or they're graduating, they should come to Louisiana or Detroit. Those are the places that they should go, because they'll be welcomed and asked to transform things, asked to join in on making things better, which is great. So the Lake Belt has some advantages. The Lake Belt has phenomenal symphony halls. The Lake Belt has classic neighborhoods with big tree-lined streets and historic houses with front porches on them and all kinds of things that are very appealing over and above lake effect snow, if you like that kind of thing. So we make pictures of what could be, and we think big, and then we think about how to act on them in our own neighborhoods. Inspired in part by Louisiana Speaks and prodded on by the round of HUD grants that many of these regions got in order to do similar plans, Andres and I have had the privilege and occasionally the torture, but mostly the privilege of working together on a 7-county plan for the 6.5 million person region in Southeast Florida. It's 7 counties, 50 years, so it goes from Vero Beach, Sebastian Inlet to Key West, and captures West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami in between. Now, this is a very hard thing to get your mind around, and then we actually sat down and we looked at pictures from 50 years ago. And we compared before and after all that had happened in the 50 years, and we became more confident because we realized that many of the things we had seen unfold in our own lifetimes in that place had happened because people drew lines on maps, and they wrote down policies, and they made decisions, some of them not so great, admittedly. But they made decisions, they drew lines on a map, and then the implications of those reverberated for a very long time. And that's basically how we build our story when we want to talk to the part of the world of which we like to think of ourselves as the center. Now, we have boom time going on there too, and it's rattling our cages a little bit. Over that 50 years, the conservative projection says 6.25 million people will become 9.25 million people, so a 3 million person increase. And so we had to conduct over the last couple of years a pretty outrageous public involvement process, again inspired in many ways by your Louisiana experience, and got a lot of people to touch the plan in person or online in other ways. And so we've actually come now to the end of a very long timeline and just published a draft of the 750 report. And if you want to see what some of the other regions are doing, I would urge you to go there, 750.org, and you can download the report and send us your cold, hard critique by email. And it required us to do some things that hadn't been done before. No one had ever tried to hook together the models, the data. No one, for example, in the 6 MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, had ever tried to make one transportation model they could use to analyze implications across county lines and so on. So we got them to sit together in the room and do that, to make their computer pipes weld together, which was interesting. And so the document that came out in the end isn't a book of discipline that everyone must follow, but instead it's a big, fat collection of good ideas and the stories that we encountered along the way and the tools that were discovered along the way to help people bring about the change they see in the region as they act in their own community. One of the interesting sort of transformative aspects of it is there was an awakening to the importance of public transportation and local investment in it that came about as part of this, and so there's a good bit of that. And there are good trends that help us when we're encouraged by the trade and the tourism, number one, in tourism in that region, and trade as well. But we also have trends that are not so great, like some of the drop in education levels, the concern over sea level rise I know you share. The map on the left is the conservative 2 feet projection for 50 years. Of course, we always worry about these numbers because, as anyone on your shores will also tell you, it's 2 feet on the way to some higher, scarier number at a later time. And then the one on the right shows the effect of another 3 feet from tides and surges. So you get the idea that in our wafer-thin landscapes, Louisiana and South Florida may not be producing the majority of all this impact on the atmosphere, but we are certainly going to be in the front line on dealing with it. Then we also have the concern you probably have noted in your own statistics of a shrinking middle class. And as you've done with your previous regional plans, we boiled the variables down into a series of scenarios. One that's the trend, business as usual. One that assumes the growth will be accomplished through the old school method of endless suburban expansion. And a much more aggressive couple of scenarios, the best one, called region in motion. And it was actually very interesting to us that when we put those out on the street and had a whole lot of people touch them and read them and balance their own values against them and so on, the vast majority of people who have seen it have said they prefer the most aggressive scenario. And that's a scenario that gets us with less farmland destroyed, more people shifting out of cars and into walking, biking, and transit, saving a lot of money on infrastructure, and all kinds of things that should be getting better with time, in a time of progress, getting better. All sorts of things that you would hope would reduce in a time of progress, reducing. So those are encouraging analyses that came out as a result of it. I'm actually the most excited about the pieces of the regional plan that don't look like a regional plan. They look like local plans. They describe the way that the big picture for the region, smart growth, plays out on individual neighborhoods. A little town, a big city, and then there's sea level rise. Highway A1A in Fort Lauderdale last year surprised us right in the middle of the planning process by washing away. Well, it surprised the people in Fort Lauderdale a little bit more. And all of a sudden, the concern over sea level rise and what this might mean for us long term became very, very vivid. It was actually encouraging that they worked very rapidly and put that road back together. And they put it back together better than it was. Higher, stronger, accommodating bikes now, the trees now. They actually put it back better than it was, which I thought was a very encouraging sign. Like you, we have low-lying places. We're on coral, not on the deltaic soils, but sea level rise is a big concern. For example, here in the Keys, an area many of you might know along one of the mile markers, what happens with 4 feet of sea level rise? Or what happens with 8 feet of sea level rise? Now, who knows? The 2 feet that we've been told officially is the current forecast could be wrong, it could be worse. Rolling Stone says it's going to be worse. Don't read that article in Rolling Stone. But at any rate, we produced images to get vivid for people exactly what that might mean, and then what they would have to do to transform their built environment if they wanted to stay in that place with that much sea level rise. There's the aggressive scenario again with all of the treatments and raising land. So I'm going to leave you with just a handful of exhortations about thinking big. First, don't let this round go. Don't spend a tremendous amount of your income over the next decade and look around and say, well, where did that all go? It's happened to you. It happened to you in the middle of the 20th century. You had boom times, and you looked around when it was done, and the built-in evidence around you suggested that you had made, or at least your forebears had made, the place worse rather than better. You don't want to do that again. You want to do what those inspiring photographs I showed you in the beginning did and make this round of prosperity really count. Second one, remember, the rules are different. So don't set everything up to fight the last war. Look ahead and plan for the coming generation, not the last one. The recent editorial in National Newspaper was written from the millennials to Mom and Dad, the boomers. Dear Mom and Dad, we're not going to buy your house. Don't say I didn't warn you. Next, there will be a lot of people working on implementing your plans. You know, you've been building momentum these years, first in Baton Rouge and then in New Orleans and now in both places, also in Lafayette, on and on. You've been building this momentum. You're about to go big with your smart growth. Little experiments that you've been making are about to get really to scale. So as that happens, you will be descended upon by people who know all of the details about the plumbing, or know all of the details about the auto traffic, or know all of the details about economic development or what have you, and they will attempt to get everything they want according to the best practices of their specialty at the expense of all others. And I would urge you not to do that. Instead, step back, think big picture, and you'll realize that you have to bring the requirements into balance. Now, the planning can create a certain kind of paralysis. Planning director in a big city recently said to me, "Victor, we can't plan yet because we don't know what's going to happen." And I said, okay, you can be paralyzed across time and across space because the translation is, I can't decide what to do in this piece of the earth that I'm studying today because I don't understand how that fits into the larger jigsaw puzzle of the city as a whole, or the region as a whole, or the mega region as a whole, or the country as a whole. Am I sure? And so you have to do a certain amount of planning just to check that box. Second, you will be tempted to include everything. And we certainly have made this mistake with 750. Someone would say, well, why don't we research this? We say, okay, write it down, research that. And we did gather a tremendous amount of data in an attempt to include everything anybody could think of. And I actually, looking back on that, see that as a little bit of a trap now. Comprehensiveness is not possible because every time you add something, you will be tempted to add something else. We always plan in an environment of imperfect information. L'Enfant planning Washington or Burnham planning the Great Plan for Chicago did not all have all of the answers about the future. They did it anyway, and that's what you need to do. So that means you need to let it go sometimes and agree to let people make decisions on their own over time where it's not something that has to be done in advance or from the top down. Worst nightmare for the planners in the room. Yes, I just said that. I'm one of you. It's hard for us to take this, isn't it? But hear it from me. Not everything has to be planned in advance. Make the next round of prosperity count. Thank you.